I'm Bradley Graham. I'm the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and on behalf of everybody at the bookstore and all the staff here at Six and I, welcome. Thank you very much for coming. We're very excited to have Amy Chua with us this evening. Amy is a law professor at Yale who's written and spoken extensively on matters of culture and identity. Her new book, Political Tribes, addresses a theme that's become especially topical these days, as many bemoan the splintering of America into groups of one sort or another that seem to have little interest in uniting or compromising or even trying to get along. One of the founding notions of America, of course, was as a democratic system in which differences of race, ethnicity, religion, and so on would be taken up in a shared identity. But these days, messages that appeal to shared values seem repeatedly trumped by messages intended to exploit narrow group identities. Amy argues that both in our international affairs and our domestic dealings, Americans have fallen prey to tribalism. Abroad, we have all too often been blind to it, and at home, we have a debilitating tendency to revert to it. Among a number of positive reviews of Amy's book, one in the Washington Post called it, quote, compact, insightful, disquieting, yet ultimately hopeful. Hopeful because for all her critique, Amy, who herself is the daughter of immigrants, sees signs of people trying to cross divides and break out of their political tribes. Whether all these efforts actually amount to a definite seismic trend is debatable, but at least they're encouraging, and psychological research shows that humans can, in various ways, break the tribal spiral. Now, as an added attraction this evening, Amy will be in conversation with J.D.Vance, author of the best-selling Hillbilly Elegy, his compelling memoir about growing up poor in a family of Appalachian values and habits. Amy and J.D. know each other pretty well. When J.D. was a student at Yale Law School, Amy took an interest in him and in his background and helped persuade him that his life and his conclusions were worth putting down on paper. She even ended up introducing J.D. to the person who became his literary agent. We should all have such help with our literary undertakings. But Amy has said that mentoring J.D. has been a two-way street for her, that she has learned a great deal from him about a world that she had known little about. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Amy Chua and J.D.Vance.
Hi,
well,
J.D.
Hi. So this is my first ever interview, it's my first ever interview as the interviewer and not the interviewee. So I want to beg your forgiveness in advance for the fact that I've never done this and will likely be pretty terrible at it. But I thought that I would start by just talking a little bit more personally about how we know each other. And it's, of course, occurs to me that like you said earlier, my book is really at least partially because of you, because you introduced me to Tina Bennett, my literary agent. You gave me some confidence that the book was worth publishing, and I guess the only thing that I've ever really done to repay you for it is come here in this beautiful synagogue and have a nice conversation. So it's been a pretty one-sided relationship. But maybe we could just start talking a little bit about where that relationship came from for those of us, those in the audience who aren't familiar with it. And I'm curious, because I've never asked you this question, but when I was a student at Yale Law School, what did you think about me and why did you encourage me to write this book?
So I met J.D. His very first day of law school. He was one of maybe 70 students in my contracts class. I remember he sat in the very, very back row. He was a tall guy, stood out. And in the front row over here was a woman named Usha, who is now JD's wife. I think JD and I clicked from the very beginning. It's really interesting. I've said this on the record. Superficially, it would seem like we have nothing in common. I'm the daughter of Chinese immigrants. Both my parents have graduate degrees. But I always felt like an outsider growing up, which is why I'm so interested in tribalism and identity and cultures. I've never fit in anywhere in some ways. Not in this country. When I go to China, I certainly don't fit there. Not in California, not in the Midwest where I started, and not now on the East Coast. So JD and I bonded. I remember we had so much weird stuff in common. A little bit of not liking pretentiousness. We remembered eat all you can buffets. We both lack some impulse control. I mean, we just had lots of views in common. Anyway, the end of the story is quite interesting. I was in January 2011, I'll never forget it. It was January 8th, 2011. My life completely changed. Before then, I was a mild-mannered professor writing about foreign policy and ethnic conflict. That's actually what I do. And I wrote this book, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, and the Wall Street Journal excerpted it with the just incendiary title, Why Chinese Mothers Are Superior. And it went just completely viral. Interestingly, in a parallel way to how JD's book went viral, but in a positive sense, But in my case, it was very bad. I mean, I had no social media, no Facebook. I didn't Twitter. I mean, I was not equipped for this. I was getting, hundreds of hate emails per second, child abuser. It was just terrible, terrible. And I still remember being in a hotel room by myself, just so upset, lonely. I think I was in Seattle. And I get an email from JD. I got 2 emails. He was studying for his contracts exam. So the first email asked me some boring question. If contractor A builds a house, 3 hours later, it's now 1 in the morning, I get a second email from JD, and I can tell he's had maybe a beer or 2.
or more than that. More than that. And
what's amazing about JD is he had the least money of anybody at Yale Law School. Yale Law School is a pretty privileged place. Part of this problem that we'll get to. JD is like the one guy with no money, somehow goes and buys the book. And this is another thing that we have in common. I mean, a lot of people talk about books without having read them. JD read the thing. He read the thing, and then he wrote me this long email. And this, believe it or not, even in my own trauma, I read this email where he said, I can't believe you got in trouble for this. At least you were trying. He told me a little bit about his own family, which he had previously not told me. You had sort of more suggested that your mother was a nurse. I mean, you never said she was. And I saw it in this email, and I sent back, and I said, you need to write this story. You just need to write the story. And what's funny is I threw a book party for JD last year, I think. I went and dug up my old emails, because maybe like a week, I don't know, maybe a few days later, no, it was that same evening, he sent me something. 10 pages of just his own thoughts. And I found them, and they are the exact same opening as Hillbilly Elegy. It's in this email that he sent me on January 13th, 2011, are like the almost unchanged pages of the book. So anyway, that's the whole story.
Well, I remember that in law school, where I always felt a little bit lost. You were such a good mentor, not just to me, but to other kids and other students as well. And I always felt I could rely on Amy for sort of cultural advice. Like, I don't know, sure, I don't know what job to apply to. I don't know what class I should take, but I could always go to you to sort of be like, how should I behave in this particular social circumstance? And you were always very comfortable offering that advice. I do remember, and I don't know if you remember this, but I'll try to jog your memory a little bit, where there was this moment, I think that it was toward the end of our first year of law school, where I thought that I had burned this bridge with you. And the reason I thought that I had burned this bridge is we were going, we went out as a class, maybe in smaller groups, but reasonably large groups, 10 or 12 of us. And we were out for drinks, and I remember the dozen or so of us were talking about law school and talking about life, and you like to get to know your students, and so we did these things every now and then. And at the table next to us, there was this incredibly belligerent drunk guy. And I remember for the 2 hours that we were sitting next to this guy, I just kept thinking to myself, act like you've been there, act like you've been there, don't say the thing that you want to say to this guy. But he just kept on going on and kept on sort of suggesting ridiculous things about the table and was criticizing me and my classmates. And then finally I stood up, and I think the exact quote that I uttered was, "Can I effing help you?" And I said it in a really loud voice, and I made it clear that I expected and indeed invited a confrontation with this particular person. And it sort of immediately I thought to myself, this is a terrible mistake. I've lost my temper, and this person who's been incredibly kind to me for pretty much my entire experience here is never going to speak to me again. But almost immediately thereafter, the person who stood behind me backing me up was...
my husband. Yeah, no, we have a lot of, we have a lot of stories.
So that was a fun experience. So enough about that. Let's talk about this incredible book, and it's really excellent. I will read just a bit from what I wrote in the blurb to the book. In this book, Amy Chua argues that tribalism and the social dysfunction and violence that come along with it is the norm all over the world, but the United States managed to escape its worst impulses thanks to a shared sense of national identity. But there's trouble on the horizon. And let's talk a little bit about that trouble, and maybe we can just start for those, I imagine most haven't read the book given that it's only been out for a few days. Maybe you could just walk us through the basic thesis of Political Tribes. Here it is again.
Okay.
If you haven't read it yet, please go and buy it. And then we could talk a little bit about some of its implications.
Okay, so the starting point is that human beings are tribal. Really tribal, I mean biologically so. So some of my favorite parts of the book are actually not quite about the politics part, but there are some fascinating studies. I'll just tell you about one. Recently, researchers took kids that were between ages of 4 and 8 and randomly assigned them to the red team or the blue team, and gave them T-shirts of the corresponding colors. They then sat these children in front of these computer docs and showed them computer-edited images of children, half wearing blue and half wearing red. The researchers then asked the children, the subjects, for their reactions to these kids. The results were astonishing. Even though these children knew nothing about the children in the pictures, they consistently and passionately said that they liked the children better who were wearing their color. They wanted to allocate more resources to them, and they thought they were better in every way, smarter, more moral, nicer people. Almost more troubling, these kids displayed a unconscious bias. When told stories about these kids, and then they asked the children about them afterwards, the children systematically remembered all the good things about the people wearing on their team, and all the negative things about people on the other side. So, and there are tons more studies like this that show that we desperately want to belong to these groups, and once we connect to a group, it's almost like facts don't matter. We just want to see everything through the lens of that tribe, and if you are presented with evidence that your tribe is doing something wrong, something bad, your response is often just to stick to your tribe, and your feeling in doing that is not that you're being stupid or irresponsible, it's that you're being loyal. So that's the starting point. So when I originally started writing the book, it was actually going to be only a foreign policy book. And I'll explain how it became the book that it is. So 3 years ago, I was writing about how the United States, when we go out in our foreign policy, we tend to think of the conflicts in terms of grand ideological battles. Capitalism versus communism in the Cold War. And then the next wave, it was authoritarianism versus democracy. We were going to do the democracy. And then after 9/11, it was axis of evil versus freedom. It's always these grand principles. And we always think that democracy is going to be the panacea. So the result is when we go into a country like Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan, we don't pay any attention to the group identities that matter most to people on the ground. And there are reasons I get into in the book, but basically part of it is because of our own extraordinary success with assimilation. The idea is, look, if in this country, Germans and Hungarians and Poles and Irish and Italian and Japanese could all become Americans within a generation or two, then why can't Sunnis and Shias and Kurds, we just need to have an election. That'll take care of it. Well, the problem is that if you understand these tribalism and you understand the demographics, democracy often catalyzes group conflict, not soothes it. So maybe I can talk later, but I give an interesting example of Vietnam. I know most people here know by now that the United States, we saw Vietnam too much through a Cold War lens, and we underestimated the extent to which the Vietnamese people were fighting for their independence and sovereignty as opposed to Cold War Marxism. But here's something that I bet most of you don't know, and most experts in the field still don't know it. I've talked to some, and that is that there was a different ethnic problem that we completely missed and that completely undermined all of our efforts in Vietnam. And that is, we didn't care about the difference between the Vietnamese and the Chinese. It's funny, as an anecdote, I was going to go on TV and somebody in DC helping me said, don't use this example because Americans don't know the difference between Vietnamese and Chinese. They're going to think it's the same thing, So our foreign policy, we assumed that Vietnam was a pawn of communist China. If anybody, you could see McNamara later talking about, if you had just paid a little bit of attention to the history of Vietnam, you would have seen that that is impossible. China is this gargantuan behemoth country. It's like a big genie sitting on a little lamp, with the lamp being Vietnam. China has always been the #1 enemy of Vietnam. Every myth they have, every hero has always been fighting China. China invaded Vietnam and colonized it for 1,000 years. So the idea that Vietnam would be a pawn of China's is foolish. But more importantly, and then I'll stop with this, inside Vietnam, there was also this ethnic dimension, and that is that Vietnam had what I call a market-dominant minority. That is a tiny 1% outsider Chinese minority. They weren't Vietnamese, who controlled about 70% of the country's wealth. This is true of all the Southeast Asian countries. So my point is that most of Vietnam's capitalists weren't even Vietnamese. And the US missed this. When we come in, we're going to support capitalism. They failed to see that from the point of view of the Vietnamese people, we were asking them to fight and die, basically to keep this resented, hated minority wealthy. So that's, the book was originally going to be about how our blindness to these incredibly important tribal and group identities are responsible for some of our greatest foreign policy disasters. And how did I get to the domestic part? Last February, I'll never forget it, I was teaching a class that I have taught for 20 years. JD was in it. His wife Usha was in it. It's a popular class called International Business Transactions, but it's where I talk a lot about my own ideas about democracy and ethnic conflict. And this was 1 month after President Trump had taken office. I was talking to this large class, and I was doing the whole thing that I've said for 20 years. I was saying, because developing country dynamics are so different from our own, we keep messing up our foreign policy. So in developing countries, for example, you often get demagogic politicians with no political experience who sweep to power on anti-establishment platforms, scapegoating minorities and targeting other people, and sweeping to power on an ethnically tinged wave of populism. And I was actually talking about Hugo Chavez. in Venezuela, which I've written about. And I stopped, and there were 80 eyes looking at me, thinking the same thing, and one student finally said it. It sounds like you're describing America. And that was last February, and so the book took on a life of its own. I had to rethink a lot of things, but basically, a big point of the book is that the United States today, for reasons I can get into, for the first time in our history, we are starting to display dynamics much more typical of developing countries. Things that we thought, that'll never happen to us. These populist movements, lurches towards authoritarianism. We are starting to see some of these exact same patterns, and they're very predictable right here in our own country. And so the book is an explanation. It's not random. I think a lot of people are puzzled. How do we get here? Once you start looking through the lens of democracy and tribalism, and you look at the parallels to other countries, it's actually very predictable, and it's also why I'll get to that. I mean, I think if you understand the problem, you can better overcome it.
So I want to talk about the domestic side of this in just a bit, because I think in a lot of ways it's the most interesting and certainly the most relevant in a newsworthy type of way to a lot of the discussions we're having today in the country. But I want to just scale back a little bit and talk about the why, and the why of why is the United States, or at least why are most people in the United States relatively blind to this happening? So you can see it happening in Vietnam, and certainly, as you argue, it's a big part of the reason we didn't understand the underlying dynamics of the conflict in Vietnam. There were some people, they weren't a majoritarian voice by any means, but there were some people who argued that the entire adventure in Iraq would end in disaster because we weren't giving proper credence and understanding to these ethnic conflicts, the Sunni Shia thing, but also the Kurdistan versus Arab thing in Iraq. And of course, when I deployed to Iraq, I remember that a lot of folks that I served with, we were reading this book by Natan Sharansky called The Case for Democracy, which is very influential in the Bush administration. It was very influential among a lot of American foreign policy intellectuals. And the basic argument was, look, as soon as you bring democracy to people, they vote for people who serve their best interests. These ethnic conflicts start to fade away. And the good, decent, wise, popular will starts to take over. But that obviously wasn't a convincing argument then. And I think the reason I'm so curious in why you think that Americans are relatively blind to this is because if you're right, and I think that there are certainly ways in which your argument is compelling, that this has become an American phenomenon in a way that it hasn't been, at least in recent history. Why are we so blind to this? Why are we so blind to the fact that all over the world, ethnic identity, racial identity, religious identity matters more than national identity as the United States and its people often conceive of it? Why does it matter more than we often give credit to?
So 3 simple reasons that we tend to be very blind to these more primal identities. The first is that democracy really has worked very smoothly in this country for a very specific reason. America, for most of its 200-year history, was dominated overwhelmingly, economically, politically, and militarily, and culturally by a white majority. Obviously, with white being a moving target, not all groups were considered white, but basically, whites dominated this country. So that what happens is democracy is very stable from a political point of view. There are plenty of tribes and voices and smaller groups, but they're all oppressed. So free market democracy in a situation where you have one group that is overwhelmingly dominant economically and politically is very stable. So, we felt like a lot of people feel like, why is there so much tribalism now? All of this dissent. There's always been tribalism. There's always been these groups. It's just their voices were suppressed before. They didn't have a voice. Point 2 is what I already said. We have had a very successful history of assimilation, so our blindness is also rooted in some of our deepest, best values. The Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was always about overcoming these sectarian and religious and terrible ethnic things. The idea, these principles, democracy, individualism, rule of law, these things will triumph. And America, the experiment, was the Great Enlightenment experiment. We're going to have markets that are neutral, democracy that's neutral. And what I point out in this book is that democracy is not ethnically neutral. And markets are not ethnically neutral. The principles may be, but they disproportionately benefit different groups. The final answer, JD, is I hate this term because I now think it's overused and part of the problem. But I think another reason we've been blind to these group differences is racism. In Vietnam, I got very kind endorsements from both General Stanley McChrystal and David Petraeus. I do not know those men before, so it's not an inside job. And they agreed with me that that United States did not pay enough attention to the tribal identities, to these smaller sectarian identities. And in Vietnam, for example, it was just the Asians, the Vietnamese, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, they're all gooks. They just all sandy-eyed gooks. What's the difference? And I won't go into in Iraq. General McMaster, he did something very successful in this search. He was the first person to really pay attention to these tribal and sectarian identities, and he turned it around for the time that he was there. One thing he specifically said was if you use a derogatory term, a racist term, to refer to all Arabs or all Muslims, you are basically handing the enemy a victory. So I think that's another reason. They all look the same. We have some negative view of all these brown people or all these Chinese people, Asian people.
So to take this to the domestic policy realm and political realm, so I remember being in New York City the night of the election, and I was attending a party held by a number of Republican Party leaders who frankly expected the election not to go especially well. And it was one of these weird vibes where around 9 o'clock we're all sitting around drinking and hoping that by 11 or 12 we've had enough that we're not going to be so sad about the news that we hear the following morning. And there were, of course, many Trump skeptical Republicans in the room, but this wasn't a room that just expected the election to go against Trump. It was a room that expected the election to go against the entire Republican Party. And I remember getting a call around 9:30 or 10 from ABC, and they were doing their election coverage with George Stephanopoulos, and they called me and they said, we need you to come in. And I said, why? And they said, we need somebody to talk about the white working class, because this election is not going the way that we expected it to go. And I said, oh, interesting, sure, I'll come in. And so I called a cab and I went to ABC Studios, and I remember arriving there, and there were a couple of things I heard in the aftermath, and also an experience that I had that night at the election headquarters in ABC that have continued to stick with me. So the first is that you heard a lot of commentators say in the wake of the 2016 election that the white working class had, for the first time in American history, voted like an ethnic group. That there had always been Poles and Italians and Irish and Scots-Irish and so on and so on. But for the first time, you could say that the white working class, meaning white Americans without a college degree, seemed to be voting in the way that traditional ethnic groups had voted in the United States. And that's something I heard a fair amount, and obviously bears a little bit on your thesis. But the flip side of that is that the folks who were working in ABC, and these weren't just media folks, these weren't just journalists, they're of course television producers, TV personalities, and so forth, they acted almost like somebody that they really loved had just been killed. And there was this sense of deep, abiding grief at the studio that night. And it occurred to me that if the white working class was voting like an ethnic group, then this was the group of people I was spending time with on election night at the ABC studios. They were kind of akin to an ethnic group because they were grieving together. They were reacting not just as if they had lost an election, but if it's something really deep and culturally affronting had just happened. And that was, that experience is really what makes me so interested in the thesis of your book, because I do sometimes wonder that we're behaving, our political ideologies in the United States or our political groupings in the US are behaving more like ethnicities than they are like traditional American political institutions. And I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Great. First I'll just say that I was among the few people who was not surprised by the election. And I can explain some of that later. It's more of what I kept hearing being whispered underground. So here's why I think we are where we are. First, the massive demographic changes that we all know about, the browning of America. Immigration in the last 30 years has really, the flows have been much, much bigger, and the composition now, principally before it was from Europe, now mostly from Latin America, Asia, and Africa, so that whites are, for the first time, on the verge of losing their majority status. The predictions are by 2044. So back to what I said, for most of America's history, whites were comfortably dominant. And when you're so overwhelmingly dominant, you can do terrible things, invidious things, slavery, oppress, but you can also afford to be a little more generous and enlightened. What's happened now is every single group in America feels threatened. It's not just blacks and other minorities who feel threatened. Whites feel threatened. A study in my book says I think 67% of the white working class feels that they are more discriminated against than minorities. It is not just Muslims and Jews and Buddhists who feel threatened. Christians now feel threatened. With the Me Too movement, it's not just women, it's men, straights, gays. We're at this moment where every group feels threatened, and every group, this is tribalism, thinks that the other tribe's claims to being persecuted and discriminated against are ridiculous. So that's part of it, this demographic change. The second reason we are where we are has to do with why you're the expert on this, JD. And I think when you read a lot of stuff in the papers, it's wrong. There's all this flinging around white supremacy, white nationalism. It is simply not helpful to call half of the country white supremacists. It's not actually what's happening. What's happening is much more what JD referred to, which is what I call in my book, we almost have two white tribes now. That is class, and it's not just money, but it's really educational levels and almost like a cultural divide has split America's white majority. And it's interesting that JD used this term ethnic because long before I was the Tiger Mother, my field was ethnicity and ethnic conflict. I have a 17-page footnote describing what ethnicity is. And it's very difficult, and there are constructivist views and primordial views, but the one feature of an ethnic divide is if you don't intermarry with each other. That is, your ethnic, this is not a perfect definition, but groups often don't seem to be ethnic differences if you can intermarry, because then that difference goes away. And this is something new in America because of this drastic decline in geographical mobility in this country, something else that JD's working on. It used to be, Tom Brokaw was just talking about this, that people from the Midwest would, through education or whatever, you could go up and you could go to Silicon Valley, or sorry, not Silicon Valley, you could trek out to California or any of the coast and rise and come back. Now, it's so expensive to live in the coasts. Silicon Valley, New York, Atlanta, and also education has no longer, it's no longer the route that it was to upward mobility. People are stuck. There are all these studies. So there's much less fluidity. So the coastal elites, a misnomer because they're not all coastal, and they're also not all elites in the sense that they're not all wealthy. That term refers to professors and journalists and activists. And coastal elites are also not all white from the point of view. They're often, I think it's better to describe this group as these multicultural, well, pretty much everyone in this room. People like me, we are, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you are view yourself as tolerant, and you know lots of minorities, and you believe in religious freedom, and you've traveled a lot, and you've seen people from all over the world, and you probably think of yourself as not tribal because you believe in individual rights and human rights and cosmopolitanism. Well, this group tends to be very, very tribal. And going back to the ethnic difference, there is so little intermarriage between this kind of multicultural, coastal, white, but mixing with, like my own family. My husband's Jewish, that it's like the ethnic divide between the two white tribes is much starker than with other ethnic groups.
So we should go to audience questions in the next few minutes. So while I ask this question, while Amy answers it, maybe if you have a question for either of us about any topic, please just line up the microphones and we'll answer as best we can. But I wanted to throw a couple of provocative ideas out there. And the first is from a friend of mine who you know reasonably well. His name is Raihan Salam. He's the executive editor of National Review. He's the son of two Bangladeshi immigrants, and is in some ways, I think, because of his experiences and the experiences of his family, is this deeply patriotic person in a very ideological way. He really sees America as this great melting pot. But he wrote a column that got a fair amount of attention, but not as much as I thought it deserved to. And I forget the headline, but it was something along the lines of white supremacists for open borders. And his point was that if you want to have an ethnically ossified and segregated society, you should support very high levels of immigration because that tends to lend itself to ethnic clustering. And so if you're a white supremacist, what you should want is a large immigrant population because it reduces the intermarriage rate between different ethnicities. And just to your point, his argument was that what you want in the United States is a sort of happy medium immigration rate where obviously you have enough folks who are able to come in, contribute to the economy, contribute culturally and so forth, but not so many that it leads to this ethnic clustering. And I think that's something that's at least relevant to our current immigration debate and our current immigration conversation. And the second point that I'll just throw out there, and I'd love to get your response to it, is when a lot of folks who were very upset about the election of Donald Trump, there were two separate strands of thought that I heard on the left. Neither of which coexist with each other super well. One was that this is not what America stands for, that Donald Trump is a xenophobe, or Donald Trump is this, or Donald Trump is that, and whether you agree with the exact criticism, the point they were trying to make is that America is the shining city upon the hill, and it should hold itself to a higher standard. That's one, what I'd call the liberal critique of the Trump election that I heard a fair amount in the wake of the 2016 election. Another critique that I've heard from what I might call the left as opposed to the liberal side of American politics is that this is precisely what the United States of America is, that Donald Trump is worse than anybody says that he is. He's just as bad as his harshest critics say, and he is indeed, in that terribleness, the embodiment of what America really is. And I think that second argument is not just misguided. I think that it actually may lead to the types of ethnic tensions that you talk about in your book, because if we don't have some common idea of an American nation, if we can't at least appeal to the same shared value, if America is, and instead of a shining city upon the hill, just a terrible country that elects terrible people, then what argument or what common idea, what common sense of purpose can we appeal to when we're arguing for political change, whether you like Donald Trump or you don't like him? And I don't know the answer to that. And I wonder whether you think that what I'm calling the left side of the political debate is missing something about the way that human tribes conceive of themselves when they make that argument.
So, first of all, it's interesting. Just the emails that I'm getting, even responses to books tend to be in the grip of political tribalism. I think when books come out, it's like people quickly assess, is this an anti-Trump thing or is this a poor? And you'll see from the book, I am just diagnosing the problem, and I don't pull any punches from either side. So I'm answering this. I really think that how we got here, I don't think there's any side that's blameless. I think that both political sides have been complacent and playing with fire. I do think that it's very interesting, again, going back to my point that a lot of elites don't really understand what supposedly the people they're trying to help, the poor people, lower income people want and think. So on college campuses, it's something that we feel is very important to expose the American dream as a sham. This goes to your left with that, to show, and I understand where this comes from, and I'm completely sympathetic and part of this, to show that we've always said this thing, but in fact, so many people never had access. So many people were never even part of it. Even today, people don't really have the chance to climb. Upward mobility is dead. It's a lie. All that is actually true, and that's why I shouldn't say true, but there's truth in those statements. But for a lot of working class struggling Americans, not just working class whites, of all stripes, they love the American dream. They don't hate wealth. I have all these surveys, they don't hate capitalism. Most of the people that really liked socialism or attracted to it or want redistribution tend to be pretty privileged Ivy League kids or more privileged kids. So just to finish this out, bringing it full circle, I think what's happened over and over in countries from Venezuela to Iraq, I've seen when you have a small minority that is viewed as the smug minority, like the Sunnis, the 15%, controlling the levers of power from afar, and you suddenly have democracy, you often get this demagogic populist leader that says, you know what, those aren't real Americans in control of everything. Let's take back our country. Let's take back our country for the real Americans. And that's the parallel. If you look at what Donald Trump did, it's coded, make America great again. He actually said, let's take back our country. And going to JD's point, there's this battle right now. Who are the real Americans? And the fault is on both sides. Because from the point of view of, there is a lot of racism that's coded in there. The idea is, why are these coastal elites not real Americans? Well, because they love minorities, and they love immigrants, they love Africa's poor, so it's almost like they're not real Americans. Let's take back the heartland. But then the people on the coast are equally to blame. I mean, they often say, so I agree with you, JD, that we can't be at this point where the people who voted on the other side are not just people we disagree with, but they're actually, we view them as immoral enemies, like as not Americans. If we start to view people on the other side of the political divide as not real Americans, then we really are going to fracture into two or more. So I'll stop there maybe to start taking questions.
Okay, great. So I'll moderate the questions here, and we'll start with you, sir, on the left, or your right.
My name is Jackson Richmond, and I have a couple of questions. One, JD, would you say that your mamma's, I'm almost done reading your awesome book, Hillbilly Elegy,
Thank you.
Was a tiger mom? And two, we talk about tribalism. Does intersectionality have a point?
Does intersectionality have a point?
Yes, with regards to tribalism. Is it like a solution?
Do you want
So first I'll say, you, sir, were a fantastic example of advice / an admonition that I was supposed to give, which is to ask a question and not to give a speech. So when you're standing at the microphone, please follow his example. To answer your question, your two questions, I think that in a lot of ways Mamaw was a tiger mom in the sense that she demanded a certain amount. She assumed I was probably stronger and not weaker. I think that's one of the great hallmarks of Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, is that they assume that children are a little bit stronger and not these weak things that need to be coddled. And Mamaw at the end of the day was colorful and very demanding, but she loved me and she looked out for me. And I think those are certainly, when I read Tiger Mom, I saw parts of my grandmother's story in that book. So the question on intersectionality, does intersectionality point a way forward? Maybe that's more your...
Okay, so I teach at Yale Law School, and intersectionality is a term I write about in the book and explain. It's one of the most important concepts in academia coming from the left, and I actually think that it's a brilliant and important point. I know the person who coined the term, and it simply refers to the fact that people can be outsiders or minorities or oppressed in different ways. So you could be a woman, a Hispanic woman will have a very different experience than maybe a Caucasian woman. A gay Asian man may have a very different experience than a straight Asian female. And so in its conception, I actually laud it. But what's happened, and I try to explain this, is that it's been used and exploited and spun out into the public sphere, like everything else on social media and cable news, to mean something that it really never was intended. Now it just means like exponential identity politics. So it's too big a question, but I will say that I think the core insight is incredibly valuable. But like everything else, I mean, this is the problem with tribalism. Things that start off as just innocent things become instant symbols, tribal symbols. All lives matter. You know, what could be wrong with that? That now stands for something. That now stands for something. So it's almost impossible to have a discussion because it's almost like you signal which tribe you're in by how you respond to something.
Sir.
Yeah, a question for Amy. In your book, you wrote about countries that have gone through civil wars. And when looking at rising tribalism in America, you mentioned earlier about rising insecurity among groups that hadn't before felt insecure, the anger, the geographic cleavages that we're going through. Are you worried that we could be moving towards another civil war? I mean, not next year, not 5 years, not 10 years, but moving in that direction.
So believe it or not, I am an optimist. I'm a chronic optimist. And part of this is because I really think that both sides have been behaving really foolishly and irresponsibly. So you can, despite how horrible things feel, I think you could view this as a wake-up call. But here's my more, bigger answer. A big concept in my book is that alone among the major powers, America is what I call a supergroup. And a supergroup is a group, or let's say a country, with two characteristics. One is it has to have a very strong overarching national identity, America. And the second characteristic of a supergroup is it has to allow individual subgroup identities to flourish. So this is a country, where you can be Irish American, Libyan American, Croatian American, Japanese American, and intensely patriotic at the same time. And believe it or not, this is extremely rare. So you take China. China has the super strong overarching identity, Han Chinese, but all the individual group identities are squashed, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans. Even France is not a supergroup, as I explained. It's got this very strong French overarching identity, but because of their policy of secular laïcité, the burkini ban, you can't wear headscarves. Even presidents have said you have to eat, talk, and behave like a French person. So they're not a super group either. So I believe that we have something special. I really do. I think we have something that is baked into our system, that is baked into our Constitution. We have an ethnically and religiously neutral Constitution. It doesn't mean that we've lived up to the constitutional ideals. I'm not talking about that. Of course we haven't. But our identity is actually, we have it. We have the formula. And right now, what I see is those two prongs both coming under threat. J.D. referred to the attack on the overarching identity. I happen to agree with J.D. I get in trouble for saying this because I teach on a college campus. I think there's a huge difference between saying we have these great ideals, but in the United States, we have repeatedly failed to live up to them. We have shamefully betrayed our own ideals, and we must do better. That's what I believe. I think there's a huge difference between saying that and that this is a country built on hypocrisy, that we have no real values, that we are a land of oppression. And it's such a fine difference because I think we have oppressed people. We have committed genocide. But it's that identity that I think, because as I say, if really America is nothing but a land of genocide and white supremacists, then why is it worth fighting for? It's not worth fighting for if that's all it is. So I think that we're going to go back to that. I think we have it in our DNA. And hopefully, 2018, 2020, I myself see positive signs among the new politicians. But
So I think one way to read both of your books is a critique of elites' understanding of American politics.
Sure.
But one particular elite, political scientists, who are paid professionally, there's some 10,000 of them, to understand the phenomena you're describing. I think it's also an implicit critique of those professionals. And the question is, if they got it so wrong, and you've articulated on the Trump election, the political scientists were just as bad as the average elites at the average cocktail party, how did that happen? It's a cognate discipline. The legal field and the political science, I think Yale's political science department was really not much better. So one of the great political science departments than the average cocktail party understanding of what was going on. How did it happen that those professionals paid to understand what you've described seem to get it so wrong? Maybe you dispute the premise, but it sounds
I'll answer. I think it's because of tribalism. That's why I started. So a lot of these political science and economics models are based on that people will act rationally to promote their rational self-interest. And by the way, there are a lot of great political scientists that are starting to question this right now. Cognitive dissonance, motivated reasoning. The latest studies actually show that people don't really necessarily vote for their self-interest or policy, but they vote much more out of loyalty to their affinity group or tribe. And this partly explains Donald Trump, right? I mean, every day something more horrible happens. You know, a news scandal, a porn star, this, and every day all of us think this is it. Now this is it. And you know, crazy things come out of his mouth, and what happens is while we say, oh my God, that sounds so racist or sexist, he has actually done a better job presenting himself as a member of a cultural tribe that many members of America relate to. So when they see him getting in trouble for saying this and that, they actually just relate to it, because they're always getting in trouble. You know, in their employment, people are calling them out for saying this, and they just like it that he picks himself back up, and you know, like the Worldwide Wrestling Ring, he's like their champion for that. And especially for, I think, I have some stats, but for poorer people, more from communities like where JD's from, their experience is such distrust of the establishment. It's like they've seen for generations. Who cares if a Democrat or Republican comes in? They're all elites. They come in, they go out. Nothing ever changes for us. So if the policies, you haven't seen them translating into any benefits for you, stick with your tribe. Vote for the person who's in your tribe, you know. So I think that's what political scientists miss. This kind of, their models are often built on rational choice and people maximizing welfare, and tribalism is much more primal.
So I'll offer a couple of thoughts. One, to say something in slight defense of the political science profession. I think that it's actually, as a profession, has produced a lot of interesting stuff about what happened in the 2016 election. I think that it's a very useful discipline if your goal is to try to understand the various data sets and how they explain the population. I don't think it's an especially useful predictive profession. I don't think that the goal of political science is to predict how elections will unfold. And so obviously in that way they failed, but I wouldn't say that's so much a failure as just a mischaracterization of what their underlying purpose is. And you know, why have elites, broadly speaking, missed some of the tea leaves in the 2016 election? Well, a lot of what Amy said I would agree with, but at a fundamental level, I think that it's hard for people to appreciate just how abysmal the alternatives that a lot of people feel that they actually have. I mean, if you're a guy who grew up in my hometown who's seen globalization, I mean, the best estimates suggest since the early 90s, the United States has lost 7 million manufacturing jobs. The working class, white, adjusted mortality rate has been falling for the past couple of years. Of course, the opioid epidemic, which is very terrible and has affected a lot of communities, it's affected certain communities more than others. And there is this sense that a lot of folks have back home that whatever is different is at least worth trying, And the folks who've been in power for a long time have really, really screwed up. And I think that if you're living in Washington, D.C., where the median income has exploded in the past 25 years, where the opioid epidemic is something you primarily read about in the papers, it's not something your neighbors experience every single day, it's hard to imagine why some people are so pessimistic about their political future. And so I think that people miss those folks' voting patterns. But I'll say, to close that out, the academic political science literature has produced a lot of really interesting thinking about why Donald Trump was ultimately elected. If you read the pages of Vox, for example, you would be led to think that Trump's voters were primarily racist or stupid or maybe some combination of the two. And there are a lot of academic political scientists who've complicated that narrative in a lot of interesting ways. So I wouldn't say the political science profession is so much the problem. I think all of us in our various ways are missing what's going on in the country because we're not spending, to Amy's point about geography, we're just not spending time with each other, and consequently we're ignoring what's going on. And of course, I think that applies in the other direction. I think that folks from back home could be, could certainly have a better sense of what's going on among certain communities that don't necessarily look or act or think like them. So it's not a one-directional problem, but it's a problem. Sir?
Hi. So my question is pertaining to kind of instant communication and social media and maybe the exacerbation, kind of rapid increase in kind of identifying tribes and also kind of giving them an ability to communicate and empower each other in a way we've never seen before. We've been talking about it for years. I remember in high school reading the article about kind of the elimination of bowling leagues and the problems that kind of have happened in neighborhoods since then as an example. But I remember in 2008, it kind of started with the Obama social media craze and kind of how it changed communication and really kind of started to see a divide that we've never seen before. But I remember kind of really hitting home in 2012. I'm a Republican in a family full of Democrats. I remember I posted something about President Obama at the time when he did. I remember my mom calling and saying, "Oh, if you were not my son, I'd totally defriend your ass." And she said that to me. And I thought, wow, well, anyone really could. I mean, you really can just totally simply get someone out of your life and unfriend them and never hear them through that. So what, in your experience, have you seen a rapid increase or, kind of an increase in speed in this kind of transformation since social media became so prevalent, and kind of what's been your experience?
So I'll briefly answer, and then Amy, curious to get your thoughts. But Neil Ferguson has this interesting book that came out not too long ago called I believe it's called The Square and the Tower, or maybe The Tower and the Square, and he talks about the way that the modern social network effect reinforces certain views and effectively shuts us off from other views. And I think that the effect that you just mentioned, I see something that I don't like, therefore I unfriend that person. Consequently, I close myself off from views expressed by that person. I think that's a really significant problem, and certainly that's a way that our social media reinforces tribalism. But the problem I worry about more is that all of us in this room, I'm assuming, are educated consumers of information, and I'm guessing that none of us has a really good understanding of why Facebook and Twitter and other social media puts the information before us that it does. In other words, while I worry about somebody's parent unfriending people who hold views they don't like, I worry a lot more about the fact that we don't understand the basic institutional infrastructure that puts information in front of us. We don't understand how the algorithm goes from A to B to C to D to information in front of my face. And consequently, I think that we are all living, I don't want to overstate this, we're living in remarkably uncharted territory. Most of us don't actually have a good appreciation for why we consume the information that we do, other than a bunch of people in Silicon Valley programmed to put it in front of us. And we're just now dealing with the implications of what that means.
Yeah, I think we'll just take a,
Okay.
yeah, I think we'll just keep taking,
Okay.
I agree with that.
Yes, ma'am.
I have one kind of shorter question and then one more that's in depth. The first one is there any way to, in a sense, reverse this white nationalism or racism, or do we just have to wait for certain people to die? And then the second question is, this book was something you began writing years ago. So my question is, how did the rise of Trump affect the content of your book? And what were the main changes you made to the book and to your own personal opinion in tandem with the white nationalism and identity politics that came with the 2016 election?
His book?
I'm assuming you mean yours. Yeah.
Oh,
Mine came out before the election.
Okay. Well, for lack of time, I think part of the problem is the reason I wrote the book is because people are so mad and so upset and so hurt that it's hard to think clearly. So I don't think that it is accurate to call 60 million people who voted on the other side white nationalists. And as J.D. says, they've actually broken this down and their polls. Anyway, but I do coin this term ethno-nationalism light to kind of capture what I think is going on in the United States. I think that this is a land of, people are proud that it's a land of immigrants. So when you hear people just, hurling, calling the other side terrible names, it's not helping anybody. But I think there are many, many, many Americans, possibly a great majority, who are really terrified about these huge immigration changes and the demographic changes that we're seeing. Now, among elites and liberals, you can't express that anxiety. You have to be so excited about the browning of America, because that would suggest you're a racist. But their incredible, huge demographic change is dislocating. It's human nature. So I am the biggest fan of immigration possible. I'm a daughter of immigrants. I've written 2 books about how immigration is this country's lifeblood. At Yale Law School, I'm involved in all these rule of law things for them. But I still think that Americans have to be able to say, I'm worried about immigration and what our country is going to look like and who's going to be in and how do we make the rules and what are the limits, without instantly being labeled, xenophobia, racism, Islamophobe. Because what happens is that just pushes the conversation underground. And that's where extremism festers. And that's where you really do see white supremacy, ugly, ugly stuff. And that's one of the reasons that I wasn't surprised about the election. I saw what was going underground right at Yale Law School. Because during the election, it was sort of, I think there was one acknowledged Trump supporter in the entire Yale Law School student body. And I knew for a fact there were at least maybe 20, but more importantly, there were people who were against Trump deeply, but who had parents, uncles, cousins, people from all parts of America. So when you just label all those people, so I could see that there was a lot there. So I do think language is very important. I think we need to be able to address terrorism, right? I teach at a law school. If you ever say I'm worried about terrorism coming from the Middle East, oh my God, I would never say that, because that. That's Islamophobia, that is suggesting that how about white terrorism, how about Las Vegas? But the point is that we need to allow people to express these anxieties because they're thinking it. They're thinking it anyway. So that's why I discuss this term ethno-nationalism light in the book.
The only additional comment is the white nationalism that really, really worries me is the white nationalism that's expressed by a 22-year-old who came from a relatively privileged background, who learned it on the internet and has become a marcher in a rally at Charlottesville or whatever the case may be. And that you can't just wait to die off because it's clearly gotten some foothold among some subset of young people. Right. And, not to sound like a sort of a nationalist or a cheesy patriot here, but my thinking is that the antidote to that is some idea, is recapturing some notion of the American project that a lot of people can share in. And to me, how you beat back the guys who are marching down Charlottesville, 23-year-old idiots with Nazi flags whose grandfathers defeated the Nazis 40 or 50 years ago, is to remind them that we kicked those people's asses, and to remind them that there's something meaningful about this American idea, which, by the way, is hard to do if all we're hearing from the other side is that the American idea is fundamentally corrupt.
So I have a question for both of you, if that's okay. Professor Chua, I remember reading Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother when I was in 11th grade and thinking, oh my God, I need to study for the SATs more. I'm doing this all wrong. But I remember also that like my parents and teachers were incredibly virulently anti all of your parenting tactics, even though none of them had read the book. And since then, you've been attacked for your other books as well, your books about Mormons and Jews and stuff. And I read that book, and it was not what everyone was saying it was either. But my question for you is, has being attacked like this helped you understand more like the strains of a liberalism on the left and now on the right as well? And also, how did you predict the Trump victory? And then, JD, my question for you is... Sorry.
Great question.
My question for you is, I read your book, and it seems more like you started it as like this autobiography and then accidentally predicted this huge cultural watershed moment. So did you kind of expect that you'd become the voice of the white working class, or were you just writing about yourself at first?
I didn't expect, and I still don't quite think I've become the voice of the white working class. But no, I wanted to write a book about myself, but I also wanted to write a book about some of the broader problems that I saw in the community. And so I did mean to sort of scale out a little bit and take a slightly deeper and broader look. But I didn't intend for what happened to happen. I mean, how could anybody have intended for that to happen? But.
Very quickly, yeah, that was 2011, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother controversy completely changed me, my family. Yes, it was interesting to see tribalism, and I learned a lot of things. Parenting is tribal. Like people have different sides. So just quickly, since I know we're just out of time here, I think how I could see that the Trump thing wasn't as clear is because there were so many people talking to me. Maybe this is, I like to talk to students that, just like, don't tell anybody. But this is not that they wanted to, but just like worried about this or that. And also almost all of, Hillary Clinton is from Yale Law School. We love her. She's been back so many times. We really did have a day of mourning after. It was all the classes were canceled. People were sobbing. Oh, I'm not kidding. Everybody was crying. We had my classes, students came to my house. They practically slept over. Well, frankly, a lot of people working in the Brooklyn office, wonderful people, probably some are here tonight, are actually from the same demographic. I think they later, it was not a really well, it was a kind of a coastal elite, relatively privileged, and it's hard to get good information, I think. America's a really big place.
So we just have time for 2 more questions, so sorry to cut things short. But I have, that made me think of a funny story that a guy probably 65 or so from back home who did not support Donald Trump, but when the election results came in, he told me the story about how his daughter, who has a 3-year-old at home, called him and said, "Daddy, what am I supposed to tell my daughter?" And his response was, "Well, she's 3 years old, so you better tell her to chew with her mouth shut and not worry about politics so much." And I think that's a pretty good lesson for all of us in these polarized times. Sir, your question, and then you last.
Thanks. Hello. You briefly, a moment ago, talked about the need for sort of an overarching American identity to go back to it. And I wondered, does that tie into another side of your thoughts on tribalism? Is there a strength to tribalism? Can it achieve things that perhaps we haven't heard about tonight?
I didn't hear the first part of the question, but I'll just say that, again, I had some nice questions earlier that JD started. I get tribalism. I'm a very tribal person. But I think that everybody, that's why some of the studies in the book are so interesting. One that I love shows that people will interpret facts and numbers to support their group's views. So you can show the same statistics and facts about, say, gun control, and same picture, same everything to a group of people, and half of them will conclude from those same numbers that that's why we need more guns, and the other half will conclude that's why we need fewer. And that's something we need to think about if we want to actually do something. And that study, fascinatingly, the smarter you are, they tested for this, the better you are at numbers, the better you are at manipulating the numbers to fit your tribe's worldview. So, yeah. And again, I think family is tribal. I'm a very tribal person, so I like to think of America as a tribe of tribes, right? You could think of, that's going to the supergroup idea, going back to this idea, we should be proud of this big tribe. Our identity, what makes us special, is that we allow individual, smaller tribes to flourish.
Great. Oh. Thank you. And last question, sir.
One quick question. All right, I have a question for Amy. So I was confused about what you said about the Vietnam War. So the Vietnamese were allied with China and the Soviet Union, and the original impetus for the war was to stop the spread of communism and then eventually to not be embarrassed by losing to the North Vietnamese. So I don't understand how you said the war was caused by not being able to tell the difference between the Chinese and the Vietnamese.
Okay, so yes, the Vietnam War was the North Vietnamese were communist, allied with China, and South Vietnamese that we were supporting were the capitalist part of it. What I was saying is that there are two pieces to this. A lot of our decisions during those years were assuming that Vietnam was just a pawn of communist China's. That is just a puppet. And if you look through some of the later discussions by Senator McNamara, he says this is one of the biggest mistakes. Not seeing how important Vietnamese sovereignty was, that they would never, that the one country they would never be a pawn for. So even if they were temporarily allied, the point is that it was really more about nationalism and then this ethno-nationalism than the ideology of communism. The second point is simply that most of the wealthy people in Vietnam were not actually Vietnamese. They were not Vietnamese. They were this Chinese group. And so how do you expect people to get excited about fighting for a system that's supposed to benefit this outsider group? One more fact that you might be interested in, those of you who are old enough to remember, the boat people, this is in 1978, a lot of Vietnamese came over. They were known as the boat people. 80% of the boat people in 1978 were actually ethnic Chinese, not Vietnamese. So I'll talk to students now and I'll say, they'll say, I'm Vietnamese. And I'll say, well, are you ethnic Chinese? And they'll say, no, we're Vietnamese. And I'll say, go ask your parents. Go ask your grandparents. So they'll come back and they'll say, oh my God, it turns out like my grandparents, or there was ethnic cleansing after the Vietnam War, so anybody who admitted that they were actually Chinese would be killed or sent to labor camps. So anyway, I explained the whole thing more. I'm sorry, that's just a partial answer.
All right, guys. Join me in thanking Amy Chua.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for J.D.
And thank you all for coming.